Greetings, friends and brethren. Can the Great Tribulation begin this year? Can it begin next year? How about the year after? Well, I don't think the Great Tribulation can possibly begin before 2017. Others have a different view. Are we in the continuing Church of God right? Or some of these other people who are or claim to be in the Church of God correct that the Great Tribulation could begin sooner? Well, if you take your Bibles, that's really the authority that we need to be taking a look at. Jesus mentions the Great Tribulation in Matthew chapter 24. And Great Tribulation is something that's fascinated people for quite a number of years. Now, why have I said that the Great Tribulation could not begin in 2017? And when did I start to say that? Well, I started to say that around the time of the re-election of U.S. President Barack Obama. I said after he was re-elected that I did not believe it was possible for the Great Tribulation to begin until after his second term of office ended. Why did I say that? I said that because looking at world events as well as the Bible, I saw that it wasn't practically possible that the Great Tribulation could begin so soon. Why? Because certain events have not happened. What events? Well, there's some events in the book of Daniel, chapter 9. So let's go over there. Daniel chapter 9 talks about something. In verse 26, it says, after 62 weeks, Messiah, that's Jesus, shall be cut off, but not for himself. So we see there's a prophecy that Jesus is going to be cut off, and he was. Then notice the next part of this verse. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. So I'd like to go back up. It says, these people are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, when was the city and the sanctuary destroyed? And what is this talking about? Well, this is talking about Jerusalem and in the Temple of Jerusalem, which was destroyed around 70 AD. And it says, and the people, the prince who's to come is going to destroy this particular city. Well, who destroyed it? Well, it was the Roman Empire. So it was the people of the Roman Empire who destroyed that. But notice that these people are the people that some prince is going to come from. What prince? This particular prince is somebody who's going to be known as the King of the North later. But at this stage of development, or prophetic timeline, if you will, he's called a prince. Not for back in 70 AD. That's just telling you what people he came from. But actually, this particular prince is mentioned further. Verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So what we have here is a situation where some type of a deal is supposed to happen. This deal is supposed to last a week, which most prophecy watchers have correctly presumed means 7 years. So it's supposed to be a 7-year deal of some kind. It's supposed to be confirmed by somebody who is called a prince. And that's kind of interesting because being the prince suggests he's not the king, he's not the emperor, he's not the top person, but a low-level, mid-level, even a high-level person, but someone who's not the top individual. So when he's involved in this particular agreement, whatever agreement this may be, he's not in charge. And because of that, it may not be obvious to the world what's going on. As a matter of fact, there's several possibilities with the agreement. One is it could be a 10 or 20 or 30-year agreement. You said, huh? But it says, talking about a 7-year agreement or 1 week. But it just says he's going to confirm a covenant with many for a week. So there may just be a provision of this particular covenant or deal that lasts for 7 years. The Bible doesn't say, but I just wanted to make it clear that if a deal comes out and it's got multiple parts, it's possible that it will not be perceived completely as just a 7-year deal. Because I don't think most people are going to understand what happens when it actually happens. Now, I'd like to read from a commentary of someone who's more versed in the Hebrew language than I am. And this particular one is from the Prophecy Knowledge Handbook. And so I'd like to start with this. And again, we're going back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 26 and 27. What's this got to do with the Great Tribulation? Well, quite a bit. Because you see in verse 27, it's talking about the abomination, talks about desolation. And we'll go into Jesus' words in Matthew 24 in a few moments to tie that all in. But first, I want to make clear what the Bible is teaching about in Daniel 9, 26, and 27. So Dr. Wilbur says, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And he says, it's agreed by almost all evangelical interpreters of these two events. They're cutting off the Messiah, the anointed one, and the destruction of the sanctuary refers to the crucifixion of Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Now that's what I just said, so that is consistent with what I said. And he says that this period is separated by about 40 years, plus or minus. And then it says, other important reasons for this gap are Jesus placed the culminating week with its abomination in the times of the final beast, Antichrist, just before his second return, Matthew 24. And we're going to go there in just a moment. But going back to this other part, it says, let's see what this passage says. See if Kyle is correct in asserting that the prince is said to be coming, Haba. So it's not a prince who already came. So it's not a reference to Jesus, as some have said, because he's already been introduced in the prophecy of chapter 7 as the beast. The Romans who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD were his people because they and he belonged to the fourth stage of the Roman Empire. Then he quotes the following. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. He's going to make a firm covenant. The language, this is again in Hebrew, Higbir from Gabar, be strong, does not signify a confirmation of a covenant, but the causation of a covenant. So some think that this is when the covenant begins. Others just say it's when it's going to be confirmed. It says the evil and destructive events described in the remainder of this verse should be interpreted as a summary of information concerning the final time of Jacob's trouble. That's where he gets it right. In the Church of God, we've said that the Great Tribulation begins as the time of Jacob's trouble, and he correctly refers to Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7 in that context. And then further, he says, the final revelation, Daniel 9:27 states, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, but in the middle of the 7, he'll put an end to the sacrifice and offering. The covenant of Daniel 9:27 is not the covenant of grace. This refers to the coming world ruler at the beginning of his last 7 years. He'll make a covenant with Israel for a 7-year period. As Daniel 9:27 indicates, in the middle of the 7 years, he'll break the covenant, stop the sacrifices offered, and become the persecutor instead of protector. Well, one part I do want to mention, though, where I think he's got it off slightly, is he makes it sound like this individual will be in charge at the beginning of the 7 years. And I think the fact he's called a prince then, and not the king, or not an emperor, or something along that line, suggests that this individual who's involved will not be the top individual at the time. This is important to note because my suspicion is that various evangelical Protestant types, when this deal happens, will say, wait, this person did it and he's not the one, he's in charge and this isn't it. So I think some people are going to be confused about it. But I think we in the Church of God, we see the word prince here. And then if you go to Daniel chapter 11, and let's just go there for just a moment. Go to Daniel chapter 11, and I'm going to just refer to verse 40 for a moment. It mentions the term the king of the north. And the king of the north in Daniel chapter 11 is also referred to in other places, such as Daniel 11:27 throughout. Most of the time, when it's not specifying the king of the south, it's referring to this individual known as the king of the north. Anyway, this deal has not yet happened. And if you take this deal and you cut it in half and say, okay, half of a week is 3.5 years. If you add 3.5 years to any date after June 30th of 2013, you're going to end up in 2017. And you might say, well, maybe the first day or 2 or 3, depending on how you count, this 1260-day year for 3.5 years, but that's what the Bible uses if we're going to use Roman calendar months. But essentially, especially as I make this particular video, if you get rid of the few days since the beginning of the month began, you add those to it, you get to a point of time that will be in the year 2017. So it's not possible that this is going to happen prior to 2017. That is, the Great Tribulation is not going to start prior to 2017. Now, many people believe that this particular deal is going to be a peace deal. And I'd like to read a couple of passages that suggest that that particular interpretation might be right. Now, for the first one, I've decided to read from the Old King James Version, or the original King James Version of the Bible. You can follow along if you want with your Bibles. If you turn to Daniel chapter 8, and I'm going to read verse 25. And it says, in Daniel 8, verse 25, "And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart." Now this prince who's going to become a king. "And by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand." Now the Bible talks about this individual being broken. He's talking about, his empire is talked about being broken in Daniel Daniel 2, verses 40 through 43. Also, it's referred to in Revelation chapter 17, 12 through 13, 14. This particular individual is going to be put out. But you'll notice, by peace he's going to destroy many. Okay, so in other words, this individual seems like he might be involved in some kind of peace deal. And now let's go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 23 and 24, which I think can parallel other parts of Daniel 11. In verse 23, "And after the league is made with him," this him is this king of the north, "he shall act deceitfully." So after he makes some kind of deal, he's going to act deceitfully. "For he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people." Verse 24, "He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, the spoil, and the riches, and he will devise plans against the strongholds, but only for a time." So then we see verse 25 talks about him, the king of the south, which again I think that parallels Daniel 11:40. So this particular he is the king of the north, and you'll notice a couple of times it says he's going to come in peaceably. People are going to say he's got to do with peace, but he's going to act deceitfully, as it says in Daniel 11:23. Verse 27, by the way, talks about some kind of arrangement between the king of the north and the south. It says, "Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time." So we see this particular king, the king of the north, he acts deceitfully. When he's a prince, he acts deceitfully. He gets involved in some kind of a 7-year covenant, but this is a person who you cannot trust. Because of the biblical references concerning this leader and peace and deception, many have said that it appears that this is going to be a peace deal of some kind. It may be called a peace deal, it might be called a land deal, it might be called all kinds of things. But providing some kind of security seems to be implied in this particular deal, and that's what this particular leader is going to do. Now I mentioned leaders. I mentioned the king of the north and the king of the south. One person who claims Church of God connections says that the Great Tribulation could actually begin this year, or at least the abomination of desolation could be set up. That's flat out not possible. Europe isn't ready yet, and the Arab world is not ready yet. In the case of Europe, my wife and I were there recently. Again, the Europeans are not ready to get together. They're not ready to follow a particular leader yet. They need to get a little more desperate. They need to have some other things happen. The Europeans are not very well unified. Now, they never will be, as it says in Daniel 2. It's 40-43 talks about having feet of iron and clay, toes of iron and clay, and that they don't meld well together. That's true, but they still have to come together somehow to be feet and toes, and that hasn't happened yet for them to be the toes. What will do that? Probably economic problems, perhaps civil unrest as well. But at this stage, Europeans are not to that point yet. We are not to the point where we could have the King of the North rise up yet. We are getting close to the point where we could see the prince be involved in some kind of a 7-year covenant. That could happen soon. But even if that happens as early as the fall of 2013, that would still mean the absolute earliest that the Great Tribulation could begin would be in 2017. And at this stage, unless we see some more unrest in the Middle East, it's more likely this deal will not happen this year, and it may not be till 2018 or later the Great Tribulation will start. I don't want to speculate on that part yet, but I will clearly say, and I do not consider this speculation, there is no possible way the Great Tribulation will begin prior to 2017. And there are reasons to think it probably will be afterwards. Again, we do not have a King of the North yet. We don't have the Europeans ready for the King of the North, and we have not seen the particular peace deal or covenant deal that Daniel 9:27 is talking about. What about the King of the South? Because we have to have a King of the South as well. Well, we've seen some inklings moving toward a King of the South. How have we seen those inklings? We had the Arab Spring. We've had uprisings in the Arab world. We have had a lot of things going on with a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to have an Islamic empire, basically a confederation that sounds a lot like the biblical King of the South. The same nations that are the territories the Bible refers to in Daniel 11:40 through 43, as well as Ezekiel chapter 31 through 8. Those particular territories are territories that are predominantly Islamic currently. Many people within the Islamic world want to reunite. They want an Islamic empire. So you say, well, if all that's happening, then therefore they're really, really close to getting a king of the South. Well, they may be close, but there have been setbacks. Over in Tunisia, the head of the Ennahda party, which had connections, or is a political party actually of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, they had to kind of compromise a few months back, and they didn't get all their agenda. And in Egypt, we've seen things go back and forth. The president of Egypt, who was in the Muslim Brotherhood, was deposed by mobocracy or military coup or whatever you want to call it. Of course, there are counter-protests from people supporting his side, and we can expect various violence and other things going on over there. But irrespective of how that is resolved in the short run, they're not ready yet for the rise of the King of the South, who's going to handle all of these Arabic nations and these countries in North Africa and the Middle East. They're getting closer, but we're seeing some setbacks here. And part of that, because of that, that's part of the reason why, no matter what some insist about the Great Tribulation beginning possibly in 2013 or 14, they're premature. And again, we haven't seen that peace deal yet. Now, let's go back to Daniel 9:27 for just a moment. And we'll see that verse 27 in the middle of that. In the middle of the week, he will bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of the abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. Also, if you go to Daniel chapter 11, and this time we're going to just go to verse 31. It says, and forces mustered by him. Now this is the king of the north. He's no longer a prince. This has been about 3.5 years later. And they shall defile the sanctuary fortresses And then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. So you can see this particular prince who's supposed to break the deal after he started it, about 3.5 years after he was involved in it. Let's say involved in it. Then we see he's now a king, and he comes and he does the same kind of thing that's warned about him doing in Daniel 9:27. Well, let's tie this into what Jesus had to say. So take your Bibles and go to the New Testament now. This time we're going to go to the book of Matthew. Matthew 24. And I'm going to start this at the beginning here. Matthew 24, starting verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to him to show the buildings of the temple. Okay, verse 2. Jesus said to them, "Do you see all these things? Surely I say to you, not one stone will be left on another that shall not be thrown down." Verse 3. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus says, verse 4, he answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Well, we have a lot of people being deceived now. We have various ones who say this can happen now, or it's about to happen now. And Jesus says there's a lot of things that are going to happen first. There's going to be wars, famines, etc. These are the beginning of sorrows. But that's not the end. He talks about the gospel being proclaimed, and then the end will come. And I'll get back to that later. But verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and we just read about that in Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, Daniel 11 verse 31. Whoever reads, let him understand. So if you read this stuff in Daniel, Jesus said, please try to understand. That's why it's there. Then he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who's in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation. So after all these things, when we see the great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sakes, those days will be shortened. So we see a sequence of events here. We see Jesus saying, look, there's a lot of things going to happen. It's not the end. The gospel kingdom is going to be preached to the world. Then that's really when the end begins. And then look for the abomination of desolation, because this is a signal for you to flee. And when does this happen? 3.5 years after this deal or this covenant is confirmed by this prince. Now, it's possible there could be a secret deal. Some have said that. It's possible we might not know about the deal until afterwards. Without going through all the press issues about it, and news reports, I will say that there have been a variety of news reports that say the deal does not exist yet. Okay? Again, it's possible in the last couple of weeks there was a deal, nobody knows about it, but that's unlikely. And it's possible that, again, there will be some secrecy around the deal for some time, so we may not know for 3.5 years, I mean, for the entire 3.5 year period that the deal has been done. It may take a few weeks, it might take months, it might even take longer. But the deal has not happened yet. So we know that we've got 3.5 years after the deal before the abomination of desolation is supposed to be set up. And that happens, as it says in Daniel 9:27, after the middle of that 7-year period. So that's something that we're looking towards. That's a major prophetic event to look for. Once we know that's happened, or we strongly suspect it's happened, then we've got a pretty good countdown to about how long we have. Now, there's a person who appointed himself as a prophet in another group years ago that recently has been telling, from reports that I've seen, I've received some emails from somebody who used to be in his church, as well as there are some reports from others that he apparently sent out a DVD or CD or something of a sermon, or he just did one, that he claims that the end is about now, it's getting close to time to flee, and therefore, based on Jesus' words here in verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, he's gone out and said to his people, you should not become pregnant anymore. Try not to do that. Now, is there any rationale for that? Well, there's some rationale, but his timing is off. Why do I say that? I wrote a book about 2012 back in 2009, and I talked about this particular situation. And I said, you know, Jesus is giving this warning about becoming pregnant and nursing babies in those days. This is a suspicion that he knew, by the way, that there could be birth control at this stage, because why else bring it up? Because there's nothing, you know, otherwise there wasn't much people would be able to do about this, because we don't terminate pregnancies, we don't believe in abortion, things like that. And so I said, well, a sign, and you notice that he's tying it into the abomination of desolation being set up. All right? Well, remember the deal back in Daniel 9:27, you basically have a 3.5-year notice. So, in my view, this potential warning to women about not becoming pregnant would apply sometime after that deal has been given. And since that deal has not been made yet, as far as we know, let's just do the math. Let's say somebody became pregnant in July of 2013. That means the baby will be born, I presume, in the spring of 2014. Okay? Well, I know there are some people who nurse their babies 3 or 4 years, but most people stop after about 1.5 years, because that's about when the baby wants to stop. Between 12 and 18 months, babies have a tendency to somewhat stop. So if people were to still have children or procreate in 2013, I don't see that they would be having nursing babies if it was time to flee. So I believe this particular individual is a false prophet. I've said that in the past. I think he had no real reason to go out and say this now, because I think his timing is wrong. Again, I do think it's valid to bring up to people that we are in the end times, and yes, you should make sure you can take care of your children and all that type of thing. But to tell people that they shouldn't be having babies at this stage, I think is improper. I don't see biblical support for it, because again, we've got at least 3.5 years until the Great Tribulation can begin, and perhaps even longer than that. So anyway, but that's another person who's out there suggesting that the Great Tribulation is coming soon. And as I said, he actually has a television program. I didn't mention that. He's got a television program. He puts out magazines and stuff, his group. But he's wrong. It's not going to happen then. There are other people who don't have Church of God backgrounds who claim that the Great Tribulation is going to begin in 2013, 2014. And each year, by the way, I go through a process and I look at some people who predict the end of the world, and they've always been wrong. You know, it's not that everybody will always be wrong, and some of these people, by the way, if they predict every year, and there's a couple of people who seem to predict it pretty much every year, I suppose you predict it every year and you live long enough, you're going to be right. And some people just make predictions based on one thing or the other, and they're just going to accidentally get it right. But now is not the time. The Great Tribulation is not going to begin before 2017. And again, you can see the sequence of events here. Jesus ties in this abomination. He ties this in with the book of Daniel. So the basic sequence is that sometime after this peace deal is confirmed, we're going to see sacrifices that begin. Why do we know that? Because the sacrifices are going to be cut off, as it says in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. They can't be cut off or stopped if they haven't started. Now, some have said that this means that we're going to have 3.5 years of animal sacrifices in Jerusalem. The Bible doesn't say. The Bible says they're going to be stopped. It doesn't say when they're going to start. Now, it's possible, if there is some type of a covenant or peace deal, that the people of Israel will feel that it's okay to start sacrifices. Why do I say that? Currently, based on my understanding of the Israeli courts, animal sacrifices are allowed, and technically the Jews are allowed to sacrifice on the Temple Mount. But the courts won't let them. You say, well, that sounds like double talk. And I said, well, kind of it is. Basically, the Israeli courts have ruled that the Jews have the right to sacrifice. And they have the right to sacrifice on that mount. However, they said because of political expediency, in other words, they're afraid if they start doing it, the Muslims are going to get enraged and they may invade them. For political purposes, they've decided that it's not allowed yet. And almost every year, if not every year, someone makes a petition before the Jewish courts, Israeli courts, in the springtime, related to Passover, just before the spring, so the late winter, early spring, they make some type of petition in order to possibly be able to do sacrifices there, and they've always been turned down. But it may well be, after this covenant is agreed to, then people will say, hey, it's safe, it's okay. We've always said our people have the right to do this, and some are going to do it. Now, I've seen different views of this. One view that I've seen suggests that as soon as the sacrifices begin, that's why the king of the north gets enraged. He goes down and stops it immediately. That's possible. So now I am getting into speculation. That's possible. The other view is that it goes on for 3.5 years. I find that unlikely, but I suppose it's possible. What's probably more likely is they start to do it at some point in time. And there are complaints about it. Animal rights people will probably stand up and say, oh no, this is terrible. So you've got that on the western side, if you will. The Muslims don't want it done because they don't want the Jews to do much of anything. Plus they don't want things done in the Temple Mount area. So it may be that this will build up into a crescendo. And our peace-loving, supposedly, our deceitful peace-loving, if you will, peace-pretending king of the north will say, for the purposes of peace and prosperity, he comes in and he stops the sacrifices. And that's something I think we may see. And that might be some of the rationale that we may see at that time. Now, before the end comes, the sacrifices have to began. And the gospel, the kingdom, has to be preached to the world as a witness. And some people have misinterpreted this. Some people believe that this has been done. Those associated with the Church of Rome believe this was done over 1,000 years ago. That the true gospel's already been preached to all the world as a witness, and there's this ridiculously long gap between when it's done and the end comes. Okay? That's their interpretation. Some have basically said that other people finish that work. For example, some have claimed Herbert Armstrong fulfilled that before he died, but he died in 1986. That's a long time. There's a pretty big gap between his proclaiming of the gospel and the end. The end has not yet come. I would suggest, and if you look at the Greek and you look at what it says in English here, let me just read this. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. I think it's tied together. I think in God's view, once the gospel message has gone forth as a witness, Christ's gospel of the kingdom of God message has been heard by world leaders, by representatives of probably all the nations in the world, then the end will come. Because I believe this is going to actually enrage the king of the north. It's not only this possibility of sacrifices being done, well, the sacrifices are going to be done. It's not only the possibility that the sacrifices will enrage the king of the north. I think he'll use that as an excuse. But I also believe that being pointed out by the Church of God, by those of us in the continuing Church of God and others who follow our lead, that the king of the north is rising up, that he's going to do bad things, he's going to align with the Antichrist, or he is aligned, he could be at that stage aligned with the Antichrist, that he's going to destroy the English-speaking peoples, that he's going to destroy the Arabic nation or empire. When we're going out and saying that, that's going to enrage him, and he's going to want to do something about it. And he's going to try to stop it. I've gone through that before. For those of you who haven't seen it, we have a YouTube sermon on persecutions, and I talk about that, about the coming persecution. You might want to watch it. There's also an article about that. Also at the www.cogwriter.com website, there's articles about the King of the North, so you can read more about that, as well as the final phase of the work, which we also have a YouTube video sermon on that as well. But this is going to enrage him, and he's going to come and he's going to stop the sacrifices. And again, I think he will say he's trying to help the cause of peace. Killing animals, he'll probably say, doesn't help peace. It's enraging the Arabs. It's enraging animal rights people, etc., etc. And he might say he felt that he was misled by the Jewish people, perhaps, for doing it. And that he needs to do this for the cause of peace. So anyway, so he'll come in verse 15. He's going to stop the sacrifices. Around this time, according to Zechariah 2, a decree is going to be issued. Zephaniah 2. Let's go over there. Zephaniah 2. It says, gather yourselves together, yes, gather together, O undesirable nation. Before the decree is issued, or the day passes like chaff, before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you, seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. So a decree is going to be issued at some point in time for God's faithful people to be protected. And the Bible is saying to gather together before this happens. When's this decree going to happen? I would suggest right after the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel happens. Why? Because look what Jesus says, going back to Matthew 24. Let me read it again, starting verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in a holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let him who's on the housetop not go down to take anything in his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant nursing in those babies in those days. Verse 20. And pray that your flight, not just people in Judea, but people anywhere, may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Which, by the way, I believe is additional proof that Sabbaths are going to be kept at this stage, because otherwise there's no point for Jesus to tell Christians to pray that your flight's not going to be on the Sabbath. And you don't want it in the winter because it's cold and rainy and snowing in some places and ice cold, and it'll be much more uncomfortable. Okay? So we see that verse 21 says, then there will be great tribulation. So prior to the great tribulation, and after the time the abomination is mentioned in verse 15, then Jesus said the Christians are supposed to flee, and that's when I would suspect the decree is going to be issued. That it's time to flee. It's time to go to a place of protection. Now then, the most faithful Christians are going to flee. Now some won't. Some Christians won't flee. Why won't they flee? Because the Bible talks about two kinds of Christians at the end. In Revelation chapter 12. We'll go there. Revelation chapter 12. We might as well read about two kinds. And I'm going to pick this up in verse 13. Now when the dragon saw he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So we see a time of persecution happens. And I mentioned that before. So there's going to be some persecution. Then verse 14. But the woman, that's the faithful church, most faithful church, the Philadelphians, remnant, was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she may fly in the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a times, from the presence of the serpent. Verse 15. So the serpent spewed out of his mouth like a flood, water out of his mouth, after the woman. It might cause her to be carried away by the flood, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened his mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So these people who are fleeing still are subject to some kind of persecution from Satan for a while, till they're helped. Verse 17, and the dragon, that's Satan, was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is talking about true Christians here. These people have the testimony of Jesus Christ and they keep God's commandments, but they're not getting protected. Why won't some of them get protected? Basically, if you look through the Bible, and I'm not going to take the time to do this now, but if you read about different churches in Revelation chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 3, the only church that's promised protection from the hour of trial that's going to come upon the whole world are the Philadelphians. But there are other Christians at the time of the end. There are going to be Laodicean Christians. There are going to be Christians who have the traits of Sardis and probably some of the traits of Thyatira around the end. And they are not promised protection, although some of them may change or become protected. I believe that what will happen is the message will go forward. We in the continuing Church of God will proclaim it. People will look at this who are in various churches of God or various places, including various independents, and they're not going to believe it all. They're going to come up with their own excuses for why now is not the time, or why then is not the time. It's not based on my personality. It's not based on our ability to speak like the great orators of the past. It's based on the Bible. And so what we need to do is what Jesus said in the book of Mark, which is to watch, so we may be counted worthy to escape all these things, to stand before the Son of Man. That's what Jesus said. And when he's talking about watching, he's talking about watching world events. And one of the primary world events we should be watching for is to see this idea of a covenant happening that will be confirmed for a week in the Middle East by a prince who will become the king of the north. Furthermore, as Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that is the time that Jesus says you're going to start to flee. Now, as I mentioned before, Europe's not quite ready to support this idea of being part of this close confederation. And actually, that's what's happening in the Middle East recently. Don't get me wrong, there are many Muslims in various countries who want an Islamic confederation, but not all of them. And until more of them do, we're going to see the kinds of problems that we've seen recently in Egypt, Tunisia, and some of the other lands. On the other hand, over in the Middle East, we're seeing the situation where in Syria, at some point in time, the Sunni Muslim opposition will somehow get the Assad government to be replaced or to change somehow. Because I believe that the Syrian government will also end up supporting this. But in Europe itself, they're not ready yet. I keep saying yet. There are some things that they're doing. For example, years ago, the Europeans proposed coming up with their own GPS system called the Galileo system. And when they originally proposed it, leaders in the United States and the United Kingdom were opposed to it. Why? Because they were afraid that if Europe had its own GPS type system, it could theoretically use it to launch an attack against the United States. Now, people in the United States must think, wait a second, Europeans don't seem to have any power. You mean a decade or two ago, people in the United States were worried about Europe rising up and attacking us? Yes. So what has happened since? The Europeans have been developing the Galileo system. In the United States, by the way, and this is not obvious to those of you who use GPS to get around, is actually having problems with its GPS system. Some of the satellites out there are starting to deteriorate and are supposed to basically be unusable in the next several years. So what's the solution the United States is going to do for this? Put out brand new ones, replace it with better technology, right? Not quite. It plans on replacing some, but not all. Instead, the United States decided to make a deal with the Europeans so that the Europeans can use some GPS if they want, but that the United States will rely on part of Europe's Galileo system for part of its own military defense, which I believe is dangerous on the part of the United States. Why is that dangerous? Because a lot of the wars the United States has fought in recent times have involved the use of satellite technology and other type of communication. With having the Europeans in charge of a portion of it, the Europeans can block counterattacks and other things from the United States. Well, why mention this in a sermon about the Great Tribulation not starting until 2017? because the Galileo program's not far enough along yet, and I think that that will be a component of this. What else is going on in Europe? Well, Europe has the Large Hadron Collider, which is the world's largest super collider. It has developed technologies that people thought were not possible. For example, they were actually able to capture antimatter for I think around 17 seconds, whereas people before said, oh, you can't capture antimatter. It only exists for like a billionth of a second or millionth of a second or whatever term they used. It can't be collected because it doesn't exist for any length of time. That was disproven. Will the Europeans use antimatter against the United States? I have no idea, but I do know that physics projects, large physics projects, historically have been used to develop military weaponry, and the Europeans are in charge of the largest physics project in the world. And the Germans have decided to have their own version of a super collider, in addition to the one that they're part of with the European Union, and it's called the FAIR project. The United States, on the other hand, has lost our super colliders. We have one that's almost in mothballs, and we're not planning on updating that one and making that one work more efficiently or better to keep up with the type of technology that we're seeing out of Europe. So we've got a situation where the leadership in the world for physics is starting to develop in Europe, but they don't have it yet. Furthermore, there was another interesting development in the news that I believe will play a role in this, and that is it was recently alleged that the United States has been spying heavily on the European Union and particularly the nation of Germany. Well, why is that an issue? Well, supposedly the United States, not only usually it's listening to emails and phone calls and stuff, they do that to everybody, but supposedly or allegedly they put bugs in the European Union buildings, their main ones, in the United States as well as in Europe. The ones where they have their policy meetings and all this kind of stuff, where a lot of their top leaders are at. Well, this has outraged the Europeans. They're absolutely incensed by it. They're saying, you're supposed to be our friend, you're treating us like an enemy. Friends don't treat friends like this, you're treating us like an enemy. So, Europeans are going to be upset about this, they are upset about it, and they're going to continue to be upset about it. So what's the United States plan to do about it? The United States plans on giving the Europeans what they've asked for, which is, tell us all of your surveillance, what you've been doing, how you've done it, and what you do with the information. And, by the way, quit spying on us in the future. So, the United States recently started to say that, yes, we will give you information, and they're negotiating how much spying they're supposed to do. Of course, the U.S. may lie, but I believe that this is going to result in the United States doing less surveillance on the European Union, and that's going to help the European Union power rise up because they're going to know what the United States does, how they do it, how they've done it, and the United States will have less insight what the Europeans are planning in their meetings. And no other power bloc in the world will have that type of exemption that the United States is seemingly going to give the European Union. But again, the European Union hasn't had a lot of time with that yet, so they need a little bit more. They need more time, and that's another reason why this won't happen until 2017. But all these factors are lining up. The Europeans do have a union. They do have an agreement. They have a currency. It's got problems, and I expect more problems with the euro, by the way. They're probably going to have more civil unrest up there. They're going to have ups and downs in Europe, and that's going to scare people off. It also keeps the value of the dollar from collapsing. But the situation is moving toward the time when the Great Tribulation will begin. Galileo, or something like it, will help the Europeans. Not being spied on as much by the United States will help the Europeans. Having more information in the United States intelligence will help the Europeans. Developing the largest physics projects in the world, or the most advanced physics projects in the world, will help the Europeans. All those things are happening. We are setting the stage for the rise of the King of the North, but again, the end is not yet. They're not quite ready for this to happen. But the situation is happening where events are lining up. Now, I talked about a peace deal. Is there such a deal under consideration? Certainly. For years, the Europeans have started to suggest they should be the one proposing some kind of a peace deal in the Middle East. And here's a quote from an Israeli source. Israel is increasingly plugging into EU institutions and in turn allowing European political and economic influence to play a greater part in its diplomatic and economic processes, the Jerusalem Post has learned. Yes, so we've got a situation now where Europe wants to kind of connect more with Israel, and Israel wants it as well. Now, I want to read something of interest. It says, the idea of a greater Israel lives only in the political faction to the right of the Likud. The leaders of the national majority, like their voters, have accepted the idea of parting from certain parts of Israel. Now, what's this got to do with anything? If you look at a map, Israel itself has a problem. It's surrounded by people who want to destroy it. It's true, currently there's a peace deal they have with Egypt, but some in Egypt want the peace deal annulled. And they could, if they decided to do a surprise attack like they did in the past, they probably wouldn't care about the peace deal. But if Israel gives away more land, it will find more and more it's indefensible based on the shape of Israel, the shape of its neighbors, and the lands that a lot of the world, including Europeans, want Israel to give up. Many commentators, especially if you have any knowledge of military defense tactics, say, look, Israel can't give this up, because if it gives it up, it'll get taken over. It can't defend itself. And a lot of leaders in Israel know that. But some of the leaders say, if we can have protection, we're willing to do it. Now, it's true, there are some on the far right of Israel who think Israel should be bigger, they should have the border that the Bible talks about. I'm aware that that is a view, but it is not the majority view within Israel. So how is this supposed to happen? Let me read you a quote. At this moment, the European Union appears to be the only option. The EU, under French and German leadership, could be persuaded to accept the responsibility. What responsibility? The responsibility of putting troops into the Middle East to guarantee Israel's protection. And that is something that has been proposed. That is something that a lot of the people in Israel want. That is something that the European Union has suggested that it will do. They haven't done it yet. But that type of a deal would seem to be involved in some type of a 7-year covenant that we were reading about at the beginning of this sermon in Daniel 9:27. Now, the Vatican keeps trying to make various deals with Israel, and it actually made one in June of 2013. They're trying to take over the area that the first Christian-built building seemed to be in. But beyond that, the Vatican always has had interest in the area of Jerusalem. They want to have more Catholics in the Middle East. I watched certain Catholic broadcasts, and they're complaining that there's not enough Catholics there. They want more there. They want political assurances they can get more Catholics there. They want to have a greater presence in the Middle East. They've wanted that since the Crusades. Part of the purpose of the Crusades, by the way, was to bring Catholics into the Middle East, and they brought in Catholics and Orthodox, and there are still some remnants of them there. As far as the Arabs themselves go, Arab nations like Jordan are encouraging the Europeans to come in there. That's the kind of thing that they want. But something else that I found very interesting, there was a study done in Israel. And this study was done in Israel a couple years ago. 81% of the people in that particular study, 81% of Israelis polled, want Israel to become part of the European Union. Now, I know that sounds amazing. People in the United States don't even think about that. Now, why would people in Israel want to become part of the European Union? Well, a couple of reasons. One is they're starting to have doubts about whether or not the United States will always protect them. Secondly, they feel if they're part of the European Union, they'll be protected by the European Union. Now, I wonder, and I've written about this in the past, perhaps because of the desire of Israel to become part of the European Union, or so many Israelis become part of the European Union, maybe one of the ways they will be misled by the prince, the king of the north, or people on the side of the Europeans who put together this 7-year covenant, is something to the effect of, look, Israel, show that you really want peace. Show that you're dedicated to the positions of the European Union. We in the European Union believe that you should go to your pre-1967 borders. And if you'll go there or something like that, then you'll show that you're in solidarity with the European Union, and then perhaps we would consider your petition to become part of the European Union. I can imagine that something like that could happen in the background, and that could be going on behind the scenes. It could even be going on behind the scenes now, although I don't believe that that's quite ready to be proposed yet. But it is something that I can see that could help set the stage for this. Now, a couple of years ago, Catherine Ashton, who's with the EU, the foreign minister there, if you will, or sort of like their Secretary of State, she wanted to have a Palestinian state by September 2011. She didn't get that yet. But that has been a goal of the European Union to get a separate Palestinian state. Israel doesn't want to do it, but they may do it when they feel they have to. They may also do it because they'll be induced to consider the possibility of becoming part of the European Union. And that is part of how this deal could happen. I suspect, however, that a peace deal, for it to happen, we'll have to see regional conflict in the Middle East first. It may well be that we're going to see the destruction of Damascus that the Bible says is going to happen in Isaiah chapter 17, verse 1. That this could happen before a peace deal. If Israel, for example, is actually involved in the destruction of Damascus, we'd have a situation that would horrify the Arab world and perhaps other parts of the world if Israel decides for whatever reason it has to do that. And this might be what it takes to get the Israelis to agree to a peace deal of some type involving foreign troops or involving losing a lot of its land, or to get troops in there. So there's a lot of factors that can happen. So I've been watching to see if we'll see regional conflict in the Middle East. I've been looking at proposals from the European Union and others for peace deals in the Middle East. By the way, interim peace deals have been proposed. What do you mean an interim peace deal? A permanent peace deal is like, okay, we have this deal, and this is the deal, and this is the way it's going to be forever. Even though, obviously, human beings can't make deals forever, but they intend it. An interim deal is a deal that has so many years into it. Okay, for the next 5 years, we'll do this. Next 7 years, we'll do this. Next 10 years, we'll do this. And then afterwards, we'll renegotiate. That's what I mean by an interim deal. That type of deal has already been proposed. And that also might be the inducement that Israel and or the Palestinians will need in order to go forward and do what needs to be done. Now, another reason why the Great Tribulation cannot start in 2013 or 2014 is the gospel of the kingdom has not been preached effectively enough so the world is a witness for the end to come. And again, you can read about that scripture in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. Now, has the world gotten any witness? Certainly it's got a witness. We, the Continuing Church of God, have reached, I think, at least 215 countries or territories on the internet since we began. We've reached millions of people on the radio, but millions isn't billions. Now, the Bible doesn't say we have to reach billions, but I suspect that as certain events happen, the media is going to pay attention to what we in the Continuing Church of God are saying. Not because they believe it. They'll probably mock it. They'll probably make fun of it. But more people, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, are going to hear at least some portion of the gospel message before the end comes. And then the end will come. So this message still needs to be preached. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 to pray for God's kingdom to come. So what, as a Christian, can you do to help that? Well, one, you're supposed to pray for it. And secondly, you support the work of getting the gospel out. And that's what we're trying to do on our YouTube videos. That's what we're trying to do on the internet. That's what we try to do, radio interviews, newspaper, magazine interviews, and other forms of media we try to take advantage of to get this message out. The gospel still needs to be proclaimed. A sufficient witness was not done as of January 1986. That is not the case. The gospel message still needs to go forward, and the faithful in the Church of God are going to do that. We in the Continuing Church of God are leading the final phase of the work, and that phase of the work includes getting this gospel to the world as a witness. Some will join us to do this. Some will follow us to do this. But this gospel message must be preached before the end can come. And at this moment, I don't believe it is possible this is going to happen before 2017. Now, the time is going to come when, with government censorship, most likely, of the internet and other things, that the message will not go out. I'm just going to read from the Old King James, Amos chapter 8, verse 12. It says, "They shall wander from sea to sea, and from north even to the east. They shall run to and fro, seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it." Why won't they find it? They won't find it because most likely we're going to see a situation happen where the government powers have decided that because of terrorism, hate speech, their control of the internet, etc., that they don't want the Church of God message to go forward. Going out there and going against the grain, for example, on matters such as homosexuality or homosexual marriage, as they call it, that's what they've been endorsing, is something that people don't want said. A lot of government officials don't want said. So they're passing more and more rules about hate speech and discrimination, or their definition of it. So that can be a factor. We're seeing this trend accelerate. We're also seeing that with increased surveillance that the U.S. government has admitted to doing, that it may decide to target Church of God groups for what we're preaching and what we're going to preach in the future. Now, some have said, look, there have been earthquakes, droughts, a lot of things that go on in the Middle East, a lot of bad things that happened in the last few years. Therefore, this means that the Great Tribulation has to start now. No, it does not. Let's go back to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24. And this time we're going to back up. We're going to start in verse 4. "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled." So if we do see a big conflict coming in the Middle East, if Iran is involved in a war with Israel, if Syria is involved in the war with Israel, if chemical weapons are used, biological weapons are used, EMP bombs are used, etc., terrorism is involved, all those things happen, Jesus says, see that you're not troubled. Even if Damascus is destroyed. "For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Those are not the sign that the Great Tribulation is here. The sign is when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet, which happens after the gospel of the kingdom has been preached to the world as a witness. That's what Jesus said. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the word of somebody going out there who claims to be a prophet or an apostle or whatever they claim to be. If they're not teaching according to what this book says, they're not teaching what God wants you to hear. "So see that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places." And there have been some big earthquakes. All these are the beginning of sorrows. I believe that we are in the portion of time that Jesus referred to as the beginning of sorrows, but that is not the Great Tribulation. Even during that time, starting in verse 9, it says, "They'll deliver you up to tribulation." So it can get worse. It will seem like it will be a tribulation, but it will not be the Great Tribulation. That does not happen, as Jesus said, until after the gospel has been preached to all nations as a witness. Then the end will come. And then you see the abomination, desolation spoken of. Then he says, "Go and flee. Woe to you if you're pregnant at that time, because it's going to be more difficult." In verse 21, "Then there'll be the Great Tribulation." That is the sequence that we see here. So right now, if you see things going wrong, you see things such as the United States building up massive debt, by the way. I won't take the time to go through that, but Habakkuk chapter 2 warns against those who load up pledges to themselves. This is, "Will not your enemies, your creditors rise up against you suddenly, and you become their plunder?" So yes, the United States is doing things, setting itself up for the Great Tribulation. Yes, the Anglo nations, with their acceptance of homosexuality, abortion, turning their backs on morality of the Bible, yes, they're setting themselves up for this time. But the end is not yet. I'd like to read Mark's account. If you want, you go to Mark chapter 13. Gospel Mark, from Mark, according to Mark, or is written by Mark. Chapter 13, verse 5. And Jesus answered began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will deceive many. But you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet." I'll skip down to it. I'll go here. It says, "There will be famines and troubles." And we've seen troubles. "These are the beginning of sorrows. But watch out for yourselves. They're going to deliver the counsels. The gospel must first be preached to all nations." And then verse 14, you can see the abomination, desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Verse 19, "For in those days there will be tribulations. It has not been since the beginning of creation which God created until this time, nor shall ever be." It's the same time that Jesus is talking about in Matthew. So we see the same type of signs. Let's go down to verse 35. "Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping. And what I say to you all, watch." So Jesus is telling his people that we are supposed to be watching what's happening. We are supposed to be paying attention to world events. But it doesn't mean that the Great Tribulation can happen now. Yes, I know even secular sources say that we're setting up for a perfect storm with weather issues, food production issues, genetically modified foods, etc. A lot of things are happening. World alliances are taking place that will result in the start of the Great Tribulation. This is true. Events are aligning for it. But the time is not there yet. The end is not there yet. Now, the time of the Great Tribulation is going to have persecution before and after. So I'd like to go to the book of Daniel chapter 7. And this is important to see here because, again, this is another sign. While we have certain types of persecution that happen currently, it's not the same persecution that Jesus had Daniel write down here. So if you go to Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, "The 10 horns are 10 kings who will rise from this kingdom." This is the old Roman kingdom. Again, that's the one where the prince of the people who's to come, they're from the Roman kingdom, the Roman area. And by the way, I just will make a comment here. One of the reasons that you know about the whole Roman Empire is you look at the old Roman Empire, it basically circled the Mediterranean. You say, well, wait a second. The Europeans have the north part, and the Arabs have the south part. Well, if you go to the book of Daniel chapter 9, chapter 11, verse 40, you'll see that the king of the north is going to invade and take over the king of the south. So in other words, the power who's north of the Mediterranean is going to take over the power that's south of the Mediterranean and control both sides. This is the old Roman, basically the old Roman Empire is going to be ruled by a European power. And all scholars that I am aware of who give the Bible much credence believe that that other empire was the Roman Empire. Okay? And that was the Roman Empire. Anyway, it says, after that, another will rise after them. He's going to be different than the first one. He's going to subdue kings. Verse 25. "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and intend to change times and law." So we see this person is going to persecute the saints. Then, notice what happens. "Then the saints will be given to his hand for a time, times, and half a time." This is two different persecutions. This is the persecution before the time, and half a time, the time of the Great Tribulation, the day of the Lord. And there's one during it. So there's one before and there's one during it. You can also verify that by going to Daniel chapter 11. In verse 28, it says, "When returning to his land with great riches, his heart," this is again the king of the north, shall be moved against the holy covenant. He'll do damage and return to his land. Now this happens before the abomination of desolation is set up. So if you continue on, verse 30, he gets grieved, he returns and rage against the holy covenant to do damage. He's upset against part of the church of God, probably because we will be identifying what he's up to. He'll return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So he's going to try to make a deal with the heretics and the apostates. And then verse 31, then forces are going to muster by him. They're going to defile the sanctuary fortresses, place their abomination of desolation. They're going to stop the sacrifices. And we talked about that before. So you see the sequence again. We see this time period. There's going to be a persecution of the faithful, and then the abomination gets set up. Then we're going to see a different persecution for those who did not flee, those who have not been protected, because they were given to his hand for time and half at times, which is the same time that Jesus had the Apostle John write down in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. So to summarize, we don't have a peace deal yet. The Europeans aren't ready yet. The Europeans are working on stuff yet to get themselves ready. The United States, sadly, is working on things to get itself ready to be taken over. But the sequence is first, some kind of a deal, most likely a peace deal, is going to be confirmed. And again, you can read about that in Daniel 9:27. Sometime after that, and this could be out of sequence, but I don't think so. Sometime after that, and before the gospel has been fully preached to the world as a witness, the sacrifices will begin. And again, those could slightly overlap. The gospel will be preached to the world as a witness, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. The Jewish sacrifices are going to be stopped, as it says in Daniel 9:27 and Daniel 11:31. Then, around that time, a decree is going to be issued, as it says in Zephaniah chapter 2, to tell the faithful who will listen, who will heed the words of God's most faithful servants at the time, so they will flee. And the faithful Philadelphians will flee, as Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24, 15 through 19, as well as Revelation chapter 3, and Revelation chapter 12, 14 through 17. The Great Tribulation is going to begin, as it says in Matthew 24, 21, and also the second half of Daniel 12, 1b, I call it my notes. Also, we read about that in the book of Mark, chapter 13. This should be about 3.5 years after some kind of a possible peace deal or covenant is confirmed, and probably right after the King of the North will proclaim peace and safety in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. This is going to throw people off. You compare that to Daniel 11:24. To support his invasion plans. The end is coming. The Great Tribulation is going to begin. But if you add 1,260 days to sometime after July of 2013, which is when I'm making this, it means the Great Tribulation will not start until at least 2017. The Great Tribulation will not start before 2017. Check it out with your Bibles. Do not be deceived by those who rise up and say something else. Pray about it. Watch as Jesus said. In the end will come, but it's not coming until at least 2017.